we will talk about how startups from the CE region can interest journalists from the West, from Europe, from US. And let me introduce to you Joanna Socha, Merger Market, Andrii Degeler, Tech.eu, and Mike Butter, TechCrunch.
Nice and cozy.
So let's start with the basic question, because we're all here to hear what makes you interested in startups from the CE region, or does it actually matter if startup is from the CE region or any other region from the world?
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm actually very excited to be here, so thank you for having me. And to answer your question, I'm actually a journalist for a London-based publication called Merger Market, and we cover M&A transactions and IPO all over the world, but I actually focus on Poland. So I am interested in Polish startup. It's because I cover Poland, so I usually write about Polish companies. But the thing is that we usually write about larger companies, so we usually write about larger transactions, and the minimum value of a transaction should be like 3 million euro. So that's a challenge for me, because like Polish startups, at least at the very beginning of their development, they don't raise usually 3 million euro. So yes, that's a challenge, and I have to work more to find such startups in Poland. But I really think it's not really about the origin of the startup. It's more about the scale of the startup and it being local or international. So it doesn't matter for me if it's, you know, like Polish or like Czech or like French or something like this.
What about the Western media? Mike?
Well, there are two factors really involved in this. The first is, where are the investors and which are the markets that the company is addressing? And at the early stage, and just to clarify so that everyone's aware, I write for TechCrunch, which originally came out of San Francisco. And our raison d'etre, as it were, is to write about interesting startups at almost any stage, all the way up to IPO. So they could be tiny, really, but as long as they're interesting, and perhaps also as long as they have interesting investors or powerful investors, perhaps. This is an interesting signal. And so in a market like Poland, obviously, at the earliest stage, the earliest investors are usually regional, they're local, they're from the country largely. And these are relatively small amounts. But it's not really the amount of money, it's the amount of money respective to the market that it's in. So in $3 million is not a lot of money in the United Kingdom or the United States, but it's quite a lot of money in a Central and Eastern European startup where costs are generally a little bit lower, and you've got, you're talking about a different kind of platform, for instance. So that doesn't mean to say, though, that the technology platform itself isn't interesting, because it probably, almost certainly is. It's just not reached a later stage yet. So at the earlier stages, regionality and provenance does matter more, but not necessarily in an adverse way, much more about the context in which it exists.
Yeah, I mean, so I do agree with everything said. So in the grand scheme of things, for me, it doesn't really matter all that much where the startup comes from. But since I represent a publication called Tech.eu, so we write generally about the European startups, which means that this is the limitation that we've generally got. So the startup has to come from the continent. It has to be either founded here or headquartered here, so things like that. On the other hand, if it is something that I'm working on, not news-wise, not fundraising-wise, then it doesn't really matter if it's CE or any other part of Europe, as long as it is interesting. And what I'm personally interested in, that would be mostly technology, the underlying technology with a startup.
So how do you react when you hear about the startups that have breakthrough technology? I know they all claim that they have breakthrough technology, but can technology itself be enough to make you interested?
Oh, absolutely. Of course it can, because, I mean, that's the whole point of what we're doing, really. But the relevant sort of issues around this subject really aren't necessarily always about. Initially, as I said earlier on, yes, it is kind of about where they're from. But I made a mistake, for instance, early on in TechCrunch, just by emphasizing a little bit too much where a company was from. I think we would all agree as journalists that at some level, eventually, it gradually starts to not matter at all. And in fact, there are plenty of companies that have come out of Europe that are now big in the States that even people in the States don't even know they're from Europe. They're just much big, they're standard companies. Spotify, a lot of people in the US don't even know Spotify originally came from Sweden, right? So, but that's because it is a transformational technology. They went out to prove that music streaming would be a good thing. And that's what's going to happen and will continue to happen for startups from this region henceforth.
I actually do care a lot where exactly the startup comes from, but just because I really like to see like all the stats across the region, and this is part of what we've been doing at Tech.eu, a database of startup funding, and it's always very interesting to see what how different countries are doing compared to each other, and like in general compared to other places. So I'm always trying to find out where exactly the startup was founded, and sometimes it's actually not that easy because some founders would rather have you think that they are from the US or like maybe from the UK, often where they're incorporated, but that's not, for example, where the team is based. So that's a whole different discussion, of course, but I actually do care.
Yeah, so I'm in an interesting position because I'm supposed to cover Poland-based startups and CE-based startups, but I think that generally there are just so many factors that impact, the way that we look at startups and their media potential, that their origination and kind of where they come from or what kind of technology they have, it's the least important factor. So like there are so many factors like is the founder actually comfortable with talking to media? Do they have charisma? Can they talk about their product in an interesting way? Have they already raised some financing, and do they have well-known investors on board? And what kind of technology do they have? And are they able to explain that in a clear way? So there are just so many factors that influence their media potential that I don't look at one single aspect.
So to reverse this discussion, are there any particular technologies or sectors of technology world you find uninteresting? Like you see the startup, you see what it's doing, and then you think, no, that's not what I'm gonna cover because I just don't want to cover this kind of technology. Except, of course, all the weapons and other unethical technologies.
So I'm usually very cautious about blockchain, and it's not really something I write about much. So that's about me.
Blockchain and crypto, I'm way too skeptical to write about it. I would just much rather not touch it and let people who understand it better
go
ahead.
No, I'm going to veer off in a different direction here. I think blockchain is fundamentally interesting, and crypto's currency. I mean, we don't write about currencies, but we will write about infrastructure. And if you look at what's going on in the blockchain space, effectively what it's doing is it's reimagining much of the financial world in a new way that is closer to computational systems rather than banks owning banks owning sort of, cash reserves or gold or whatever else. And that's why it's so interesting, even though it is pretty crazy. For me, I think that's actually can often be quite interesting. It's a little bit, rarefied sometimes. But certainly I'm not particularly interested in writing about another accounting package. I mean, how many accounting packages do we need to track our expenses? I don't think we need many of those. So that's pretty boring. Yeah. So there's lots of SaaS and enterprise stuff, which is, it's just a rounding error. It's just it's just a sort of another cucumber slice off technology, and it's not fundamentally fascinating. But where we think we need to go, certainly as journalists and as an industry, we need to start looking at climate, for instance. So because climate is such a big issue, and that climate technology is a booming sector.
I would also add something here, because sometimes even if the technology is boring, what could be interesting and very interesting is the industry where it's being applied in. So for me, like a story that I will almost always want to cover is a technology that could be, however boring, but working in an industry that I have no idea about. Preferably, I have no idea about that it existed. Often these technologies would also be interesting, of course, but generally there are so many different niches and rabbit holes that you can fall into that you have no idea about, and that is always, for me, a good story.
So, Mike, you've mentioned something really interesting, climate change. Is the social responsibility aspect any kind making this more interesting? I mean, do you look in a keen way on startups that try to address the social responsibility angle, that try to tackle the challenges we have?
Yeah, there's a couple of things to say about this. First of all, there's the new generation of people coming through. The oldest millennial is now over 40. Generation Z is coming through. People are concerned about social issues, and they're also concerned about the environment for very obvious reasons. And there is such a phenomenon now called climate anxiety, which does exist. But the other aspect is that if you, in many tech companies, and any company at all really, if they're not sort of looking at some of these things, either say diversity inside their workforce, or climate, or etc., sustainability, circular economy, they won't attract the workforce to do what they want to do, whether it be something that they actually are aiming at for the company's sake itself, or just the optics around how they're building the company culture. So if they don't do that, people won't join the company in the first place. The second thing to say is that in the EU, there are gradually becoming more and more hurdles for companies of any size to address. And these are environmental, social, governance issues, which are gradually becoming hardwired into the rule book about how you should start companies. And lastly, investors want to see it as well. Many of the LPs in VC funds want those VC funds to address those issues. Those VC funds address ESG and similar issues as well. So there's no getting away from it. It's just the issue is, how do we tackle it as an industry? Do we tackle it incrementally? Do we, go for broke and do something sort of big shift? Those are the things that we face, I think.
Yeah, I agree completely, and it's interesting because, you actually made some fun of me that I'm often asking about how much are you going to raise, or how much have you raised already. So I'm very focused on financials, but we are now implementing in an articles the ESG aspect, and we are adding that to the articles because our readers, investors, VC funds, and business angels, they are actually interested in the ESG aspect. So, apart from asking about, all the numbers and stuff, we are actually often asking about the sustainability issues as well.
This question is definitely in my list of questions. It's not the first one, so I try to be technology first in this case, but it's definitely one question that I would always try to ask a startup if I'm writing about it.
So just to finish this topic, is there any deal breaker for a startup that you see? You know, you are interested, you get into this, you ask questions. So are there any deal breakers that someone does or says that makes you think, no, I'm not gonna write about it?
Yeah, for me, it's like when someone changes their mind and they are saying something and then they change the story and they're like calling me after an interview that they actually meant something different and they're adding some information and they want to delete some information. That's actually a deal breaker for me often.
I mean, I think the thing is that there's lots of companies who want coverage, and it makes the difference between raising another funding round or attracting new staff or whatever it is. You know, time and time again, and one of the problems with a lot of early stage startups is they don't really understand the concept of news. So they'll say, oh, we've hired a new, human resources manager, or we've changed offices, or whatever. That we're not going to write about this. I mean, it doesn't really matter what they do. This is a wrong angle. So it has to be something significant. It has to be something fundamental to the technology platform that they're building. Perhaps that it is about money, funding rounds, or perhaps it's something else that they're doing. But you know, that's more not so much about what they do. It's like how they often badly run their own media management, I think.
Yeah, if I'm already interested, and like, what would that company need to do for me not to cover them anymore? I don't know. That would be something very insensitive to be said, or something very wrong to be done. So basically, that sort of thing.
Okay, so let's say you are already interested in a startup. When you write about it, does it shine any spotlight on the whole ecosystem? Are you into the whole ecosystem when you write about a particular startup, or you just focus on this one company and leave the ecosystem behind?
It does help. Whenever I talk to a company, I say, right, who are your competitors? Because without understanding that context, you can't really place them inside a market. And it helps to know that, for instance, their competitors have raised a lot of money, which means that the company that you're talking to is probably onto an interesting thing, or that they're going up against very large incumbents, so therefore they're going to have to be doing something fundamentally different or better for you to be able to write about them. But that's helpful. The biggest problem with startups and entrepreneurs is often that they say they have no competitors. And this is all wrong. There's no such thing. You know, it says somewhere that there's nothing new under the sun. And there isn't really. So you do need to kind of tease that out of them just to get the context of what they're doing.
I haven't seen this for a long time, but it used to be the case that I would ask who their competitors are, and they would be like, we don't talk about competitors. Like they will basically be cagey, and that there will be no reason for that, because I mean, I will find out one way or the other. That's our work after all. But yeah, I also always try to add at least some context. It depends on the format. Sometimes you just write a 300-word news piece, but still, it always makes sense to show the space that the startup occupies within their respective ecosystem.
Joanna, you obviously are interested in the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, I have to.
Yeah. So, how can startups reach you? I mean, I'm a startup founder. I have a great company, etc., etc. How can I reach you? How can I reach TechCrunch, Tech.eu, or Merger Market? What do I have to do to reach you and make you interested? Except all those things we talked about.
Well, obviously, carrier pigeon, unicorn. An unnamed amount of money in the Swiss bank account. Obviously, I'm joking. I mean, you know, all of us get pictures every day. We get them to our emails. I think sometimes when you're trying to reach out to a journalist, you do have to kind of do it the right way. You have to have somebody professional inside your organization who knows how to talk to journalists, or you can hire a PR company or PR manager. But often entrepreneurs themselves are often not so much the best person to pitch a company, because they're just so enthusiastic. It's kind of like almost like talking to an academic. But I mean, you know, I get pictures. I don't know about you guys. People message me on Instagram, and I'm like, dude, what are you doing messaging me on Instagram about your company? You know, find something, you know, more conventional, because then I can manage it. You know.
Yeah, so I actually love this question because I'm usually the person who is like preaching to startups. So actually my email address is, you know, available online. So like you can find me on every social media channel, and like you can even send me a message on Instagram actually. And if I read it, that's great. But I often, you know, don't read the messages on Instagram. So that's the irony. But yeah, my information is available online.
I know. I would say it depends on the stage. From my point of view, so I'm totally fine, and I would actually rather prefer founders to reach out themselves at very early stages. Let's say pre-seed, sometimes seed as well, just because usually at this stage they can't even afford a professional in-house or an external agency anyway, so I appreciate that, I understand that. But I think if it is the founder that has to do it on their own, then a personal connection works best at a conference like this, just like writing a journalist and scheduling a meeting. That would work best, much better than email or an Instagram message. Sure.
I know that we're running out of time, and I'm sure you've got a final question, but I want us to kind of be able to just cap off or cover off this subject of, is Poland producing the right kinds of global startups that are going to be big in the future? And I'd love to hear your guys' perspective, because my view is it absolutely fundamentally is, because this country is producing a fantastic amount of talent. It's efficient, it's smart. We've been doing some meetings with some tech companies like Pack Help and Tilco. Sorry, I always get that wrong. And these are young founders who really know what they're doing. They know the problem they're trying to solve. They know how to scale. They know how to raise money. And they're going global effectively from here on in. And I think the other thing that happened with the pandemic is that people are using remote working and Zoom very efficiently, and the investors are as well. So the investors are zooming in from New York or zooming in from London and doing investing as well, and going into countries like Poland that they might not previously have invested in. So that's exciting, I think. So I think in the next 5 years, you'll see some really big unicorns come out of Poland and the Central Eastern European region again and again, but especially Poland, I think, because these guys know how to scale now, and this new generation is coming through.
So basically, scale is this thing that makes you interested instantly. Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so as
scaling potential, let's put it this way.
So as we have only 1.5 minutes left, one sentence of one advice for CE startups, or actually any other startups, as we settled that region doesn't matter. So just one sentence of advice for startups, how to make you interested, and probably that's also an advice how to make investors interested, because it's very often almost the same thing. If they can talk to journalists, they also can make VCs interested.
I'll go first. Pitch the problem you're solving, and then how you're going to solve it first. Don't pitch the company first, pitch the problem first.
Yeah, just get out there, really. That would be about it. The more you do it, the better you get at it, the better results you receive. There is no wrong. I mean, there is wrong you could do, but at a very early stage, it's just fine.
Yeah, I'd say get comfortable with talking about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have a few seconds left. How about resilient people? The ones that don't make you interested, but they're, persistent. Do they have any chance of succeeding with you?
Oh, there's no other way of doing it. There's no other way of doing it. You've got to just keep going. That's the definition of entrepreneurship. I just often meet entrepreneurs. If I meet an entrepreneur who's given up on the idea, I know that they just didn't really have it in the first place. They've got to have tested that idea all the way to the end. That's usually how it works.
Thank you very much, Mike Butcher, TechCrunch, Andrii, Degeler, Tech.eu, Joanna, Socha, Merger Market. Thank you very much.